Looks good. And I'm going to go ahead and broadcast, which will mean the attendees will be will come in. Okay, here we go. And we'll give it a few moments for the attendees to log in and get settled before we get started. Good afternoon and welcome for everybody joining us. We'll give it another few moments for folks to log into the session before we get started. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Anita Bringus. I'm the Strategic Support Manager for UNM-Taos. We thank you for joining us for today's session, Pushing Back on the Post-Genocide Narrative, featuring our guest speaker, Joni Romero, and hosted by the Office of Student and Cultural Programming at UNM-Taos. Welcome and thank you for being with us, Joni. Before we begin with today's programming, I have a few Zoom housekeeping announcements. First, we do have the chat feature currently enabled. This will remain open during the opening remarks and introductions. We invite you to use the chat feature to introduce yourself if you wish by entering your name, title, organization, tribal affiliation if relevant. To do so, if you look on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen, and there's a single conversation bubble icon with the word chat underneath it. If you click on that, it'll open up the chat feature and you could opt to send a message to the panelists and or the attendees. So we welcome and encourage you to do so. We will be disabling that after we get through introductions before we start the presentation. And at that time, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit questions to the presenter. To do so, you'll click on the double conversation bubble icon, and that will open up the Q&A feature, which will be moderated by Ms. Velarde at the end of today's session. We ask that you keep comments in the chat and questions courteous, respectful, and relevant to today's topic. We trust that you will honor that request, although we do reserve the right to disable either or both of those features if we deem necessary. And now it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you today Turquoise Shanoa Velarde of the Taos Pueblo and Jicarilla Apache. It's my honor to work with and support Shanoa in her work as student program specialist, student advisor, and the head of the Student and Cultural Programming. Shanoa also serves as staff advisor for the Student Government Association, so she keeps very, very busy. Shanoa is also the coordinator and host of today's session. So without further ado, thank you, Shanoa, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you to both Joni and Dr. Valdez for being here with us today. As Anita mentioned, I do many things on campus, and not so much now because we're all working from home. So I want to thank all of you for being here with us as well, all of our attendees. And really, I wanted to kind of give a brief overview of how this came to be. So I did meet Joni a couple years ago at a conference, one of the many conferences I'm sure that she's presented at, and I became really inspired by her story and very, very much appreciative of the work that she's doing and continues to do. And also, I wanted to connect that to Native American Heritage Month this year. We did have a plan to carry out this goal from last year, and I'm really grateful that we're able to all come together today. It makes my heart really happy to see all of you here and to finally have this done for us, and for UNM-Taos to really hone in on these stories and for us to be able to provide these things for you, these presentations. I'd like to introduce Dr. Valdez, our chancellor for UNM-Taos, who has been extremely supportive in all of the initiatives and the work that I have been doing since I've transitioned my role at UNM-Taos over the past couple of years. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Valdez for a brief welcome.
Thank you so much, Shanoa, for that introduction. And it goes without saying how appreciative we are to have you not only represent the Pueblo on our campus, but to represent UNM-Taos. And so thank you for all the work that you do throughout, and certainly thankful for these sorts of presentations. Thank you, Joni, for joining us and sharing your stories and your presentation with our community today. And I'd like to also say thank you to the Taos Pueblo administration, working closely with the governor, Concha, and also the ward chief Lujan and the staff over the years. And obviously the last few months have been a little challenging, have kept us from doing some of that work in the way that we would normally do it. But in the past, we have certainly had some really strong ties. And before I talk about what those ties have provided and allowed for, let me just take a moment here to read a tribal land acknowledgement. So if I could. University of New Mexico Taos sits on the traditional homelands of the Red Willow people of Taos Pueblo. The original peoples of current day New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache since time immemorial have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous people. We gratefully recognize our history and work to maintain healthy, fruitful relationships with our neighbors for generations to come. Now, that a land acknowledgement is something that is not only meaningful to the Pueblo whose land we sit on, but also meaningful to who we are at UNM-Taos. Because what it reminds us of daily is that as an institution, we're here to provide post-secondary educational opportunities, not to all residents, I should say, not only one group of students, but to all of the students in this area. And we've remained committed to that. And as a result of that, I'm happy to announce that we saw, despite the challenges that we saw the last few months, a 4% increase in our Native American student population at UNM-Taos. In terms of headcount, over 100 students are actually identified as Native American on our institution, and the majority of them are from the Taos area, but we do have some that are taking classes online through at Gallup, and we also have some that are located in Albuquerque. And lastly, I'll say through our dual credit program, we've expanded dual credit with the Jicarilla Apache up in Dulce, and it was an honor for me to go out there last year to meet with them and to talk about that relationship. And we started off with one English class, and my understanding is that we now expanded into two, one English, and I think we may have even added a math. And the reason that we were able to do that is because we identified an instructor out there who was Jicarilla Apache, who was working on her PhD. And unlike some institutions that would require that person to teach that class on their campus, we understood the importance of being able to hire that individual as a UNM-Taos faculty member and allow her to teach out in Jicarilla, because we thought that that would mean not only more to her and the role that she played, but most importantly to the students, because we were meeting them where they were at and making sure that they could be successful. So it's with great honor that I share all that and I share this space with you today. And with that, I will turn it over. I will turn it back over because you didn't come here to see me. But Joni, I do want to say how much I really appreciate you being here today and giving us an opportunity to learn things from a different perspective that oftentimes goes, as you mentioned, I believe you'll talk about, unnoticed, and oftentimes in worst cases, even just completely overlooked. So I'm glad that you're with us, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valdez, for that explanation of the ongoing and continuous relationships that UNM-Taos works to build every day with our neighbors, our Indigenous tribal communities here in northern New Mexico. I cannot say enough about how appreciative and grateful that we are to have a chancellor such as you to support all of the things that we need supported in our communities. So thank you very much for being here as well. So I wanted to introduce Joni now, and after that, Joni will go ahead and take the mic and go ahead and start her presentation. So as I mentioned, Joni and I connected a couple years ago, and we, throughout our work that we do across the state and really within the networks, we really connected on this idea of, you know, having the federal Indian boarding schools narratives told through her story, and also how that is an ongoing colonial aspect of going into our Thanksgiving holiday and the narrative that we are all very much accustomed to. So Joni is a mother of 4 children and a wife. She is from the Pueblo of Cochiti, New Mexico, and she serves as the president for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She is the founder of Corn Pollen Consulting, and she currently serves as executive director for the Laguna Community Foundation. Joni's research focuses on the impact of federal Indian boarding schools and the continued ripple effects of policy that we are continuing to see today. She has always been super supportive across the board as well with the things that I bring to her and the different ideas that we discussed throughout our years and time knowing each other. So I wanted to express my sincerest gratitude to Joni for continuing that conversation with me and being here today. So we can all get ready and welcome our guest of honor today, Joni Romero.
Good morning, Tuetsi Hopa. Thank you so much for all of those warm welcomes and sentiments to express, making this a possibility for today's webinar. And I'm really honored that we're able to share space together today, this week, as we approach what America calls the Thanksgiving holiday, and shed some light on the idea that I believe, and I argue through my research, that we are actually not in a post-genocide narrative as is explicited through media and common culture around Native American people and Indigenous studies in general. So I want to also thank Dr. Valdez for that beautiful land acknowledgement and acknowledging the people of Taos Pueblo. And I too want to acknowledge the land that I come from, and I'm coming to you today from Tewa territory in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I want to also acknowledge the different land that is represented from the various locations of the participants as well. And I want to iterate that the goal of today's presentation is to tie back to some of these concepts that we see, again, in popular culture, especially in Indigenous representations, and how we're reclaiming that narrative for ourselves, and commonly seen as land back, a phrase that we see in some of these forums and dialogues around how we are addressing federal policy that has continued to affect us, how first contact and how we have survived that for time immemorial as well. And so in thinking about how land back is the overall larger picture to what we will talk about today, I also want to, speak a little bit about my experience as an educator. So I actually came to this work as a Keres language teacher in my community. I started out while I was in high school, and I taught Keres for about 7 years, and then moved into post-secondary studies and taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts for about 3 years. Like Shanoa mentioned, I am currently serving as the executive director at Laguna Community Foundation. And, being a part of a system where in each of these realms, education, philanthropy, there's so many themes that we can really tie back to this narrative of land back, because we can't have all of these shifts that we're seeing in federal policy without the government, acknowledging and bringing this truth aspect to what we celebrate. I also want to start off by acknowledging everyone's experience of COVID-19. You know, for some of us, we've been affected directly within our own families, our extended families. Some of us have lost family members. We've seen our communities affected by the numbers of cases that we're seeing, the lack of access to food, especially for folks who are in quarantine. And, you know, COVID-19 will have forever altered the way in which we go about into the world, how we go to the grocery store, and also the 5-second rule, if I may add that. But nonetheless, you know, the guise of COVID has served as a backdrop for governmental policies, and we continue to see that magnified through the disproportionate numbers that have affected specifically the Pueblos, our Apache relatives, and our Dene relatives here in the Southwest. We have seen terminology used by this presidential administration regarding the pandemic, including herd immunity. We've seen the racist and xenophobic terms to describe alleged origins of this virus as well. And simultaneously, we have also seen, you know, this timeline of federal Indian law and policy play out before us. And I think, you know, as a parent, one of the times that I dread the most is the fall, because not only are we trying to reclaim the narrative around Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day, but then we move right into Native American Heritage Month. And, you know, simultaneously, our children are bringing home arts and crafts from their schools that still pay homage to that pilgrim relationship with first contact of the Wampanoag people on the East Coast. And so, you know, when we think about where we are at post-1970s, the self-determination era as coined in federal Indian law, I have to say, you know, we have to really push back and challenge that notion. So we've continued to witness, you know, this racial revolution that's happening right before our eyes. We're seeing children being kept in cages at the border, taken from their parents. And we've seen this before during the boarding school era, and when children were forcibly taken from their parents. And so if you think back to that concept that I first shared in the beginning, land back, you know, we can't say that people are illegal on stolen land. And I just really want to, you know, highlight on that idea and pivot on the idea that, you know, news outlets are currently describing this treatment at the border by ICE officials of brown children, to include them being locked in cages. There's also the unknowing sterilization of women that is happening, along with other gynecological procedures. And we've seen this to happen to our Native women as well during the 1970s. Additionally, when we think about, you know, these two pandemics that we're in, we're seeing not only the coronavirus pandemic, but again, the racial revolution that's happening right before our eyes. We're also thinking about all of the situations and outbreak. And I just, being in philanthropy, having seen the continued fight for the for racial equity in some of these spaces, it's been really telling of how, you know, philanthropy was built on not only stolen land, but on the backs of Indigenous and Black slaves who have contributed to this generational wealth that we see today, you know, exhibited in some of these family foundations that exist. And it doesn't come without, you know, addressing the current fight that we're in around saying the names of these victims, such as Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, who were brutally murdered just months ago. And, you know, as soon as that climate changed for us in the nation, I saw this wave of underlying tones of racism that existed in spaces that, you know, I didn't expect to have to come head on with. And as we continue to see that play out through the voter suppression that occurred, that has this narrative that wants to bring light to all of the hate that exists in some of these realms as well. And also thinking about this white supremacist militant violence that has also occurred. Again, as Native people, this is something that we've seen before. And I think that as we, continue to envision the outlook for what new administration might bring for us, we're still going to be in a battle to really hold strong to all of these ideas that, again, that we're in a post-genocide narrative. Additionally, for those of you who don't know, we're also currently witnessing the closing of Acoma Laguna Indian Health Services Hospital, and the Pueblo only just a few days ago acknowledged that they were in a state of emergency because of this closing, and thinking about the continued rise of cases that are happening around Pueblo country specifically, and how folks don't have access to be able to go into the hospital anymore, and the nearest hospital is over 60 miles away. Again, these are replicated kinds of policies and acts of these federal entities, such as Indian Health Service, that we have continued to see magnified. And COVID has really shown it to us in a completely different light. So going back to this timeline, I want to just highlight on these different eras. So when we think about relocation, part of this was around our eastern coastal relatives who were pushed westward for the westward expansion. And then you move into assimilation era, which is the one I'm going to highlight on the most during this presentation. You see the first full taking of children from their families, thousands of miles away to places like Carlisle Indian School. And currently today, we still see boarding schools that exist, but that reclamation of self, of community, of culture, and of language are what position and align students now in the curriculum. Santa Fe Indian School is a great example of that as well. This third era that I'm defining as reorganization really speaks to federal policy that came from the government to terminate and reorganize tribes under constitutions. Cochiti is an example of a Pueblo that still operates from a traditional form of organization, meaning that we do not host elections to appoint our leaders. They are actually appointed by community members. And then the fourth era that we see as termination is sort of another take on reorganization, but more in the sense that tribes lost their federal recognition. Many tribes lost their state recognition as well during this time. And then in the fifth piece, you'll see within self-determination that this was a movement around really reaffirming what sovereignty means to tribal communities. We saw many acts come out during this time. Indian Child Welfare Act came out around this time. And in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act also was passed. And that was actually when Native American people could then begin practicing ceremony legally again. And then present day, looking at this fifth era as being post-genocide, that we've moved towards this narrative that not only popular culture, the media, and all of these frameworks around promoting racial equity that were there, but we know we have so much more work to do. So this is a snapshot of the state of COVID on April 29th at the peak of the pandemic. This number actually continued to grow for Native American people here in the state, and it reached close to 60%. And if you look at the breakdown on the right of the populations according to percentage, you'll see that we make up, and it's kind of cut off, but we make up about 10% of the state's total population. But yet this virus affected us in a way that, you know, continued to magnify. I took this snapshot from today's current COVID count, which shows that we're about 17.5% of the current cases that we're seeing. And specifically where I work in the Pueblo of Laguna, not only has tribal operations come to a complete halt because of the 150 plus cases that they're seeing, but folks are also in quarantine, and I'm talking about like entire families. And so we have currently over 100 families that are in quarantine, and that equates to close to 400 people. And so when you think about, you know, being in some of the rural locations and not having access to the basic necessities, having to come into town, for example, to pick up groceries and or prepare, and also simultaneously seeing the continued hoarding that's happening in the stores here locally, you know, it just creates this continued panic. And so, you know, we can't talk about all of these things without talking about racism, because again, you know, there's been so many things that have happened this year with underlying tones of individual racism, interpersonal racism, cultural racism, and the list really could go on and on and on. Most familiar to me is institutional racism, being in spaces including philanthropy and academia where we're seeing, you know, and experiencing pushback from our superiors and hierarchy as a whole, not valuing or allowing a person like myself to come to the forefront and to shed light on some of these topics, and or to only be included in some of those meetings, let's say, or conferences and whatnot, where, you know, you're represented as the Native expert, and only in that role are you, you know, going to do that. But behind the scenes, that, you know, takes place in many forms as well. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because I want to keep a check on our time. And then additionally, I want to tie this back to some of the first Indian law concepts that really allowed me to dive further into my work as an educator and think about, you know, stare decisis, which is a Latin term. And when we think about, you know, what that means, really it translates to what has been decided. So when we think about federal Indian law and how that has continued to set precedents, the first case that the Supreme Court saw in regards to federal Indian law was Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. And the question that was before the court was, did Indians own title to the land? And so when we, you know, assess further in how the holding of the court was that discovery gave land ownership and title to European settlers, but that Indians still had the right and occupancy to use the land. You know, those are concepts that are still referenced back today. And I think also, you know, later on as we see cases unfold, we, you know, see the idea that there's this ward to guardian relationship in the cases that come after McIntosh, meaning that the government has a fiduciary responsibility to uphold its wrongdoings to tribal nations. And we see this through systems of support, such as Indian Health Services, for example, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, to name a few. And the continued magnified presence of this is exhibited through the substance abuse issues that we see in our communities, the health disparities, the environmental issues and degradation of our land, as well as language and culture loss. And when we think back, you know, to that historical timeline, what can we attribute to, you know, this timeline, and how can we pull upon those forms of resiliency to really hone in on what today's narrative truly looks like from an Indigenous perspective. It was just a few years ago that the Standing Rock protests against NoDAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, happened before our eyes, and we continue to see news outlets not only silence the perspective of Indigenous peoples, but the fact that this is unceded territory, it was never given up, you know, and that folks in this day and age are still asking that the government honor these treaties. And when we think about all of the broken treaties that we've continued to see, you know, how does that contribute to this idea that we are in post-genocide narrative? So specifically thinking about Carlisle Indian Industrial School, this really was the military mindset of Richard Henry Pratt, who was a colonel in the US Army. And his idea was that, going back to termination era, that if we couldn't get rid of the Indians, let's take their children, let's re-educate them, and we will assimilate them, and then they can become citizens as defined in that era. And his mantra was, kill the Indian, save the man. So Carlisle was opened its doors in 1889, and it stayed open until 1918. And it saw tens of thousands of children through its doors. And I had the opportunity to visit Carlisle in 2017 and carry some prayers and some very personal offerings to those that are buried in the cemetery. So there's over 200 plus individuals that are in the cemetery, and one of them is actually a Pueblo student from Cochiti. This is a photo of girls, Pueblo girls, when they arrived at Carlisle. And, you know, as you can see, they were in their traditional clothing. And I also like to hone in on the girl that's standing in the back. She kind of has this, you know, smile or unsure look on her face as to what's going to come next. Well, what comes next is for children who arrived at all of these schools, not just Carlisle, but they were given new clothes, new names, their hair was cut, they were bathed with lye-based soap. So if you can imagine, you know, toxic chemicals to practice hygiene in arriving at some of these locations, you know, how abusive that is. And I want to point back to, I believe it was in June of this year, when number 45 also had advised folks to ingest disinfectant. And, you know, it brought me to not only like being angry, but also I got on my Twitter and I had said something along the lines of like, we've seen this before. This is like Indian law and policy and the same things that are happening all over again right before our eyes. And I was extremely, you know, frustrated. But moreover, into some resources where folks who are tuning in can go and do some research themselves. And it's really been such a tool to me. So in 2017, when I visited Carlisle, I actually had the opportunity to participate in a Teachers Curriculum Development Institute, and we were able to access hands-on some of the files that were in the archives at Dickinson College. And of course, when I got there, one of the first searches that I used in this database was to search for Pueblo children. So as you can see, there's a total of 631 entries, and there are a variety of like images and student files and whatnot. And then I started digging deeper, and I realized that, you know, there were actually images of these individuals that I knew of in our family, both on my husband's side, as he's also from the Pueblo of Cochiti as well, and also on my maternal grandmother's side as well. And realizing that, you know, that we are only about 5 generations out from this happening to our family, to our direct bloodlines, and looking at, you know, some of these stats around their weight, how many years they stayed for, and what their experience might have been like at boarding school. So circling back to the Cochiti boy who's buried in the Carlisle cemetery today, and also thinking about how the present day location of Carlisle Indian School is actually the Army War College. And you have to get government clearance to be able to visit the grounds. It's a really pretty heavy procedure that they follow to be able to get in, even just to visit our relatives there at the cemetery. And the location of the cemetery was actually moved from its former location. So if you can, you know, see on this student identification card, they defined that the date that Pedro Sanchez was discharged as was May 9th, 1886, but cause of discharge was death. And so in 1931, when the present day location was reorganized, they actually moved the cemetery about 600 yards to the back end, and they also moved the remains of all of these children as well. Like I said, there's over 200 plus individuals that are buried there, but again, when we hone in on some of this data around student experiences and looking at what they must have felt, you know, while being there at Carlisle, we see Pedro Sanchez was 4 foot 10 inches tall. He weighed 87 pounds, and he was at Carlisle for a period of 5 years, and subsequently passed away and didn't make it home. You know, continuing with some of the heaviness of this, the impact of boarding schools, we see that through individuals having loss of identity, low self-esteem, no sense of safety, also feeling institutionalized, difficulty forming healthy relationships. On the familial level, we see loss of parental power, because when you think about these individuals who were at these schools, they were not taught from their teachers or from the people that were supposed to care for them how to love one another, how to love or even say I love you. Tribal communities saw this as, you know, directly a loss of that sense of community. And when we think about our pueblos and how we come together, and, you know, those efforts and coming together are an extension of our core values, it's really heartbreaking to think that some of these children came home to their communities and didn't want to be a part of that anymore because of what they were told. Again, that led to loss of tribal traditions and ceremonies. And then we, you know, as a whole, see that at the macro level as weakened nations from tribal nation perspective, and depleted numbers for enrollment as well. Looks like it's loading. We'll skip that. This is, I'm not sure why my slides aren't loading fully, but this is actually taken from the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Volume 1, publication, and it talks about, I apologize for it being cut off, but it talks about the intergenerational historical trauma. And, you know, for those that are out there in social services and thinking about how we define adverse childhood experiences, you know, boarding school should really be one of the many ways that it's defined for children that survived and returned home. And so again, you know, the magnification of these experiences, including neglect, violence, abuse, even sexual abuse, is something that is perpetuated as we continue to see through adult adverse experiences as well. Oftentimes in our communities, we see this as lateral violence against one another. And, you know, it's sad to be a part of some of these circles where we're trying to shift that narrative, but we're still seeing that oppression against one another. So when we think about, you know, these different layers of trauma and going back to that timeline that I shared for you, I want you to think about this from the perspective of that layer one of trauma would have been my great-great-grandfather, for example. And then with each passing layer of trauma, we see the last one being, you know, present day trauma. So not only are we presently in a race to save our culture and languages, but now also thinking about how policy has continued to affect us, how this virus has continued to affect us, and the fact that, you know, we're doing what we can to protect our most precious resources, our elders. And, you know, this virus has really taught us to step back and to pause and to reevaluate what is most important to us. For some of us, like myself, I'm still working on that. I'm definitely a workaholic and am glued to my computer at most times of the day. And for some of us, we're reconnecting with the land. I'm happy to say that, you know, that's one of the ways that I've been able to practice healing for myself during this challenging time. But if you can imagine, you know, the magnitude of all these like layers that are stacked upon each other and how that contributes to the situations that we see today, we can't go into classrooms and say, oh, that student doesn't care because, you know, they're not interested or they don't want to learn. But rather, you know, I encourage the educators that are on this call to really think about how this systemic impact of trauma is something that we're continuing to see exhibited even through curriculum. Like Shanoa shared earlier, I serve on the board for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and our vision is Indigenous cultural sovereignty. Our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the boarding school policy. And specifically, when I think about how, you know, folks can join in and help, I want to share, please become a member. It's free if you're Indigenous, and then there's also an affiliate level as well. And I'm doing a time check, so I'm about to the end of my presentation, just to let everyone know. This is a resource on boardingschoolhealing.com as well. It talks about all of the 357 schools that are being mapped out in our database, and it's continuously being added to, as well as the 12 denominations that ran some of these schools. So as I'm wrapping up, you know, one of the things that I want to circle back to again is this idea that we're in this post-genocide narrative when we're still seeing all of these policies play out against us. And I want to encourage folks to evaluate how you think about Thanksgiving and how you practice it within your families. And for many, Thanksgiving is known as a national day of mourning. The United States actually has commemorated this as Thanksgiving as a national holiday. It was actually not officially celebrated until 1637, but the true tale of Thanksgiving that we don't hear about or that we don't learn about in school is the fact that, you know, it wasn't met without a massacre of Indigenous people. So if we think about that first contact and the taking of land and the taking of food and all these things that popular culture and even the government has really reframed in a way for us to have something to celebrate. I'm not saying don't celebrate, but I want you to think about this as a time of reflection. And for Pueblo people, you know, the winter is a time for us to kind of slow down and think about all of these things and to share our stories. And so when you're gathering with your family, I encourage you to, you know, think about not only what you're thankful for, but also how you can contribute to reframing that narrative through truth telling. And then lastly, I just want to come to a close with sharing about some resources and how you can help with the current situation of COVID in communities. And so these are just a number of COVID-19 relief funds that are providing not only food security for folks, but income security as well. The last resource that you see is the boardingschoolhealing.org. And then I can also drop the digital database into the chat as well. But to wrap it up, again, you know, I just want to say thank you to everyone to allowing me to come and speak for a short amount of time. I can go on and on and on. And I'm really honored to share space with you all. But if there's one thing that I want you to walk away from with today's sharing, it's that, you know, our strength is our history. And we have the opportunity to shift that narrative through what we share and what we talk about within our own families, what we celebrate and whatnot. And so I'm, you know, encouraging you all to have a safe social distance holiday on Thursday, but also to think about, you know, the truth and where many of these things that we are taught in schools lies, and the fact that, you know, we're still trying to reframe what our educational systems look like for our children. And I thank you, and I guess we can move into the question and answer section now.
Thank you very much, Joni, for your wonderful presentation. I couldn't help but to feel a lot of things when you talk about boarding schools and you talk about our Pueblo children who are our ancestors, ultimately making the sacrifice unknowingly, and as well as the parents of that time. You know, I want to hold some space and time for them today too. That even now, as a mother, I cannot imagine my children going away from me.
Right.
And also, I can't begin to imagine what they were feeling.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I know that it's very heavy information for all of our attendees. I know that these are things that might be new to you, some of these concepts and some of these happenings, maybe you're just learning about them now. However, I encourage you to take that time to, like Joni said, reflect, even after this presentation, reflect on some of the heaviness that was presented today and try to just situate yourselves in a way where, you know, you can be comfortable with the information. That's definitely a practice that I do whenever I'm presented with these very sensitive topics and issues. So thank you everyone for sitting through that, and for Joni to explain all of the relevance and connections that we're experiencing, especially within the pandemic period. I think it's very important to remember that Indigenous peoples and our close-knit tribal communities are exacerbated in all of these issues, meaning that they're already there. They've been here for hundreds of years, right? These issues, however, through the pandemic, it's my personal belief that it's just being enhanced. Some of these problems and challenges, they're still there, you know, but because of the pandemic, they're getting worse, I should say.
Right.
access is getting worse, and, different things that require a lot of privilege, I would have to say, in order to access some of these resources, especially for our children, and just as a side note, and I'll get into the questions right after, is that my boys who are 7 and 9, they sometimes they have a hard time with it learning at home. And a couple of days ago, their dad and I sat them down and explained to them some of the stories that we have in our family about boarding schools. And not just boarding schools, but also the continuous practice of taking Indigenous children from their homes, because it did happen to my father, who was taken to Utah during the 1960s with the Mormon church community. And that was totally against his will. However, because of these issues that our communities face every day, such as alcoholism and substance abuse, my father's parents weren't able to parent him. And so we have stories in our family as well from my Jicarilla Apache side about how those students went to a boarding school located in Hesperus, Colorado, which was the old Fort Lewis college. And thinking back on that, being a graduate of Fort Lewis College, it's definitely something very powerful and empowering to see Native Americans in higher education, knowing the roots of education within our country. And so having that talk with my children the other day, it wasn't meant to scare them or to hurt them. It was meant to help them understand at their age that all of us are really going through a hard time. However, we are very lucky to have our children in our arms every single night. So thank you for reminding us of that, Joni.
Exactly. And you brought up a great point about having the talk. And oftentimes I'm asked, well, how young is too young to talk about this?
Yes.
And really, this has been an ongoing conversation that I've continued to have with my own 4 children around what it must have been like for our grandfathers and grandmothers who attended boarding school and who were taken. And for the longest time, after doing my own research within my family, asking questions about, well, which one did they go to? Because my grandfather attended both Santa Fe Indian School and Albuquerque Indian School. And when you think about, this legacy of colonial violence that has continued to impact our people in ways that have ripple effects on our communities. We see so much violence in our communities and against our women. And we see that perpetuated by these policies that are, taking our land, taking from our land, extracting resources. We see that magnified through environmental degradation, but we also see that as violence against women, and that's why there is currently such a calling for awareness around murdered and missing Indigenous women. And so when I think about how young is too young to have those talks, I was just talking to my daughter yesterday, my 8-year-old daughter, about what MMIW means, and the fact that anytime I go for a run locally or on the res to connect and to de-stress, I have my mom texting me, are you home yet? Are you home yet? Because of that. And it's the reality that we live in today, but also, knowing that there's teaching tools out there. And I wonder if I have that on my bookshelf right now, but I have a couple books that I can share, with the group. I do see in the chat that one of the questions is, how does the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition reach out to Native communities, such as Native community health representatives? And they said, thanks for the presentation. You're welcome, and I appreciate your question. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS, is reaching out to tribal nations in a number of ways. We have been around since 2011 and incorporated in 2012. And since then, we've really worked very hard at bringing awareness to this issue. And most recently, our sister representative from Laguna, Deb Holland, has also passed a bill through Congress to establish a commission on truth and healing for specifically this topic. And so when I think about, the ways that folks can get involved, number one is become a member of NABS, sign up for their e-newsletter, and you will be able to join webinars like this where we talk about even some of the neurological aspects of how intergenerational trauma has affected us. We are continuing to also build our database around, the schools that exist. And we have a number of different programming and initiatives that happen throughout the year. Last week, in fact, we hosted a Healing Summit, which was our inaugural summit. And so you can stay tuned for another one next year in 2021. But our topic was pivoting off of addressing healing narratives in the space and the time of COVID, and thinking about how the boarding schools and the experiences of these individuals, continue to it's a continuous journey for healing. And so our goal was to create some of these virtual spaces, knowing that, our elders particularly are also most affected by this virus because they're isolated. We can't go visit them, and we can't hug them, and we can't embrace them. So if you can imagine, how that post-traumatic stress may, bring back some of the feelings for what they experienced at boarding school. And now even the way we've continued to sterilize ourselves, our hands, and sanitize our hands, not sterilize. But it just, brings back so many emotions as well. But I think it's Mary,
Mm-hmm.
I can get Mary's email, maybe that. Let me grab those books.
Okay. So we have a couple questions in the chat. And so what we're going to do is we're going to turn to Dr. Valdez, who also has a question. And then after that, we can answer one more question in the chat that I feel needs to be answered. And then we're going to turn it over to one of our attendees, actually. So go ahead, Dr. Valdez.
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you so much, Joni, for a very informative, although tragic, right, presentation. And it's unfortunate that so many of these stories have to be considered research, right, because they're buried when for many of us and our people, and I'm talking about my Mexican-American culture in terms of storytelling and passing on, tragedies that have occurred. That at the end of the day, they're just stories. So thank you for sharing that and opening up, and hopefully it does move towards the healing process. The question I have is specific to what can current schools do, right? We have Native American students that are currently enrolled in public schools. What can schools do to make students feel welcome? And have you seen any progress in that in some areas that schools have become a little bit more aware and sensitive to these histories and to the current realities?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, Dr. Valdez. It makes me think about how, we're not only seeing a movement here in our state around curriculum that really uplifts and empowers and is about telling that true narrative around experiences. It makes me think about the 100 Years of Federal Indian Policy curriculum that the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center has uplifted to educators here in the state. And, when I think about post-secondary institutions and the opportunity to really evaluate what kind of retention services they're offering to their students, there needs to be this bringing to the table and conversations around how we can connect those core values that our students bring to the classroom every day to what we're doing across the board. I really think that, the dialogue around the teacher as the learner as well needs to be considered as we, are in some of these spaces that come off as very authoritative and, I know more than you kind of attitude. And I think that, that's really one of the many ways that we can reframe it. Having a conversation like this today is probably one of the biggest, ways that you can really shift away from what patterns may exist in other schools. And I am really, not only honored to be here today, but just to share space with you all. And the fact that you're on this as chancellor, and you stayed for the whole presentation, I mean, that says a lot. And so I'm really excited for the University of New Mexico at Taos and to see where things are going. And like Shanoa had shared, I was supposed to join this and provide this presentation last year, and unfortunately I lost my sister-in-law at this time as well. And thinking about how we've lost so many relatives during this time, you're creating a space for healing today as well. So I just want to thank you all and commend you for that.
Thank you so much, Joni. So just a quick time check, where we are at 12:30, which is our scheduled posted end time. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to several of the other questions that have been submitted. Perhaps Joni and Shanoa, you can review those and maybe come up with some responses that we can distribute out to attendees. But I would like to acknowledge a special attendee that we have with us today. Shanoa, would you do the honors of recognizing and introducing and asking if you'd like to maybe say a few words?
Sure, I would love to.
Thank you.
So in my work, and I know that Joni is very much situated in this space as well, of advertising your work to your family members. And I do that all the time, right? I try to get my community as well as my family to be on calls and to just engage in these conversations. And so today we actually have my grandfather on the call, who stays with my Aunt Alice and my Uncle Cameron. And I want to say to my tate that hiyaho ta'a ma'ai, and I really want to give him just a couple of minutes to share his thoughts, as he is also a boarding school survivor, and he is a senior Taos Pueblo tribal councilman who has been governor of our Pueblo as well, has held many other tribal leadership positions, and who I also commend and give all of my credit to for my upbringing as a woman, an Indigenous woman with knowledge of my Taos ways, as he built the foundation with my grandmother, my late grandmother, who we lost last year as well. So if they want to go ahead and unmute themselves so we can.
So yeah, so I'll go ahead and Shanoa, I'll do that. I'm going to promote them to panelists. So if they're willing to, they'd actually be visible, but if not, at least their audio should be disabled once I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now.
Sorry, my
Let's see.
grandfather's name is Mike Kuncha.
And let me try to unmute here. So it looks like they're in and unmuted. Can you hear and see us?
Yes, we can hear you. So here's my dad, Mike Kuncha. He enjoyed the presentation, and he always has wonderful things to say and words of wisdom. Thank you, Dr. Valdez, for always supporting our people, and Ms. Romero for this presentation. So here's a few words from my dad, Mike Kuncha.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I've been through a lot of things during my life as an Indian man over here at Taos Pueblo. I've been the governor twice over here, served my people. I've been a lieutenant governor on down, clear down to the war chief. I mean, a chief of staff in
Lieutenant Governor.
Lieutenant Governor. Yeah, so I'm an elder already. My years are 88 years old now, and I'm still going on good. But all the things that I've went through, sometimes I remember. I can remember my high school years down there in the Santa Fe Indian School, but they were teaching us the wrong way. Now I realize that they were teaching us the wrong way because we when we come back here at the Taos Pueblo, after we graduate, we didn't know what to do after we graduate. They didn't tell us how and where to find a job or go back to school, because they didn't even let us know there's some Indian colleges around, and we just go into working, you know, like anything that we can find. And then we were bad on some things, but we get along okay.
Army. Army toy.
I was in the Army for 3.5 years, in Korean War. And I worked at the Air Force Academy, driving the buses over there for the guys, and all stuff like that. And before I know it, I was married. So then, then I really realized that this is very important life that I am leading. So my wife, Celestina, is about a year passed out. She passed away, and now I'm all alone. So her anniversary will be next month on the 7th. I don't have a happy year this year all the way through. So I'm glad you are telling us this all, what you are learning about a long time ago, and keep on going, so the other young ones, the youngsters that are going to school will learn and push this on forward, so when the other classes will be just fine as they are today. I'm glad that my children, my grandchildren are going to school. Shinoa. Shinoa's good girl. If you have her seen some Indian songs, just ask her and her husband. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for all the talk, and I can remember my English anymore, so I just have to say tall number one to
So I wanted to say thank you on behalf of my dad and my niece Shanoa. We're very proud to have my dad on. He's been such an inspiration to all of us, because he's promoted our education, you know, to go vote, to be a voting member of society. Even though he went through many hardships, he never stopped encouraging us to do good things and to learn. And I'm so grateful to him to continue to teach us our language when we were growing up, even though we moved away to Colorado and we came back home and started our traditional culture here. It was like they never stopped learning, and they never stopped teaching us the way, because they knew it was important for our culture. So I think not much has changed over these generations and years, but through this healing process, I have faith that through our resiliency of our people, that we will continue on a good path and bringing these stories to light and never forgetting the history, because sometimes it does repeat itself, unfortunately. But I have hope in Congresswoman Deb Haaland and all the different Native American legislatures that are in our state and also across America, and through the universities, helping spread this really good information and keeping these programs alive. And so thank you so much, and many blessings to all of you.
Thank you very much for that. Made me feel very, very so many emotions right now because again, my grandpa is a very well-respected elder here in my Taos Pueblo community. And like he said, he has been through a lot. And I think that's where, you know, we take it next, is that we remember that our elders are strong and resilient, and that they come from hard places. And that I heard one thing, just to wrap it up, I heard one thing in my studies from a very, very influential mentor of mine, is she said, we cannot blame our elders for the choices that they made, because they had to make hard choices. And I wanna end on that, because we saw everything that Joni presented, and again, to put ourselves in those kind of mind frames, and to remember that it's not normal to do this to people, right? It's not normal. However, despite that, we still have thriving, beautiful Indigenous communities. We still have thriving, beautiful Indigenous scholars and children and artists and teachers, and all facets of this world we are represented now. And so I would hope that everyone takes the lead with this message, that it's important to support those people in those spaces, because of everything that we have been subjected to very involuntarily all throughout the history of our bloodlines. So again, thank you for everyone on the call today. And I want to extend my gratitude again to Joni for allowing all of us to hear this in a good way. I really, truly appreciate that about your work, because it's very inviting, but it's also very thoughtful. And I can tell that these things will permeate, and I hope that they do, so that we can continue to have these conversations and keep building beautiful relationships amongst one another. Because ultimately, that's what we want. We want great relationships so that we can come to understanding and we can come to healing. So these are just the steps in that process. So thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Valdez for always supporting us and being on the call and sharing his words of wisdom as well. And thank you to Anita as well for supporting each and everything that I do, whether it's little or small. She's always there to guide me through that process at UNM-Taos in a good way. So I wanted to just say thank you to everybody, and we will address the questions that we didn't get to address today. So we will get to working on that and getting those responses out.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Concha, for being here with us today. We appreciate you. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Everyone. Take care.
Peter.
If you want to stand for just a minute.
Sure.
Shano, if you want to stop or pause the video, the recording.